Hello. The following webinar is in regards to significant disproportionality, focusing on available resources. We'd like to officially welcome you to the first in a series of webinars that will outline resources to support LEAs as they think about how to address significant disproportionality related to special education. We would like to note that the resources presented in the series are not required as part of the significant disproportionality process. These are simply to offer guidance should an LEA seek out technical assistance and/or training to support their efforts. Please know that you can always reach out with any questions regarding the resources that are covered throughout the webinar series and/or to seek out technical assistance. Please feel free to reach out to Dr. Nicole Holland-Sims, nhollins-sims at patent.net. Please enjoy the first in our series. Hello, my name is Dr. Nicole Holland-Sims. I'm an educational consultant with the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network out of the Harrisburg office, and I'm very excited to have this opportunity to connect with all of you today to discuss equity, as well as how the work that is done around equity in our Commonwealth connects to the work around significant disproportionality. I'd like to take you on a web tour to give you a taste of what is available to you to support your work around becoming more equitable in regards to significant disproportionality in special education, whether that's through identification, placement, or disciplinary practices. And so I orient you to begin arriving at the patent website, which is www.pattan.net. Once you arrive at the patent website, the first place that I'd like for us to start is under the Legal tab. When you go to the Legal tab, there are a number of buttons that arise after you go to this particular drop-down box. The place that we're going to spend some time first is under Significant Disproportionality. Once you click there, it will take you directly to that page. Some things to know in this page is that there are two buttons or breadcrumbs that take you to places specific to significant disproportionality. One is the overview and calculation methodology. What I would suggest is if you click there, you will see a link that says significant disproportionality. It's a fact sheet. Clicking there will take you to a PDF that I will make larger. And with that PDF, it orients us to what is significant disproportionality as related to special education. As you continue to scroll through the document, you will get an overview of what it is, the methodology that has been used in Pennsylvania, the minimum sizes for analyses, our thresholds in Pennsylvania dedicated to, as I mentioned, identification, placement, and discipline. These are in the forms of risk ratios. As you continue to scroll, there is a section dedicated to what is analyzed, whether it's identification specific, placement specific, and/or discipline. As you continue moving, a risk ratio is outlined for you so that you have an understanding of what that calculation means, as well as an alternate risk ratio. It also indicates what happens when an LEA is identified with significant disproportionality and how funding is a piece of that component. In addition, there are examples provided around how to do calculations for significant disproportionality. I would encourage you to take the time to go through each of these examples for further information and to get more comfortable with the process of the calculation process. At this point, I'm going to return us to the website. And the next section that I want to spend some time around is resources. Once you click resources, there are a number that have been populated for you that specifically hone in on disproportionality, whether that's nationally, locally, or statewide. The Metro Center out of New York State is one of the premier organizations that focuses on equitable practices, and there are many resources that have been delivered and developed by the Metro Center that speak to supporting entities around disproportionality in special education processes. I would really encourage the use of the Data Analysis Workbook, the Manual for Identifying Root Causes, and then simply accessing the NYU Metro Center's website around disproportionality. In addition to that, we have the Pennsylvania Inclusion Toolkit, which is another great tool that the state has developed as of 2017 that supports prevention, response, and recovery related to bias-related incidents. In a moment, I'm going to highlight another place where you can access this toolkit that is a component of the PDE Equitable Practices Hub, where we'll spend the majority of our time today. In addition to that, as we consider discipline, there are a number of resources dedicated to equity and positive behavior interventions and supports. And even if you're not a school who is formally implementing PBIS, the tools that are delivered here really speak to how to address disproportionate disciplinary practices. Some other resources to highlight here would be teaching tolerance. This is www.tolerance.org. I'm going to click here for a moment just so you can see the dearth of resources that are available. So when you click on teaching tolerance, you will see that as you access this website, there are classroom resources that are developed around lessons, student tasks, teaching strategies, printable posters, also professional development, whether that's in the form of a podcast or a facilitator guide, and then magazines and publications that are dedicated to equitable practices that speak to race, gender, disability status, etc. As you can see, there are many, many things that you can spend some time around in this particular resource, and one that is highly recommended for many of our educators across the nation. As you can see, you can have the time to select on any one of the buttons to take a more deeper dive around some of the topics that we highlight. And so with the purposes of today being around significant disproportionality in special education, this may be the spot where you spend most of your time getting information and abilities to think differently about how to support students with disabilities who may have intersecting identities such as race, gender identity, etc. And now returning back to the patent website. There are also additional resources, as I mentioned here, one that speaks to significant disproportionality, frequently asked questions, which is very important as you navigate this space. And then the National Center for Culturally Responsive Educational Systems has two assessments that could be very, very useful, primarily focusing on students with disabilities and where you could prioritize some of your supports related to the numbers that you have connected to your students with disabilities and how they are being identified, placed, and disciplined. So all of the resources via the patent website under the button of significant disproportionality, again, are very specific to the topic at hand. However, what I would like to do is spend some time in what we have released in September from the Department of Education, which is the Equitable Practices Hub, which gives you an even more detailed approach to equity and the journey that your system can embark upon to not only help support the reduction of significant disproportionality for students with disabilities, but overall global systemic changes to make paradigm shifts and create access and opportunity. So if we were to go to multi-tiered systems of support, again, keeping you in the patent website so you have one place to go. If you go to multi-tiered systems of support and go to the equity tab, once you click there, there is a section dedicated to explaining how equity has been defined in Pennsylvania. In addition to that, there's also another resources tab. So briefly, I'm going to click here. And as you can see, many of the same things that you saw under significant disproportionality are also housed here. However, there are some additional newer resources that have been uploaded since COVID-19 has taken place. And so things related to remote education, how to be more culturally responsive and sustaining during the pandemic, focusing on how to embed social emotional learning and equity, and COVID-19 evidence-based resources. Again, another place where you can find some dedicated resources based on the current time. I'm going to return us back to equity. And as I said, the PDE Equitable Practices Hub has been released. And the thing to keep in mind around the hub is that there are equity pillars of practice to again support you as you think about significant disproportionality for students with disabilities. They are as follows: general equity practices, self awareness, data practices, family and community engagement, academic equity, and disciplinary equity. If I click on the link, it should take me directly to the Equitable Practices Hub. Once you are there, you are in the PDE website. And so you are able to follow the breadcrumbs to take you back to whatever place you'd like to begin. However, that link that we started with at Patent will take you directly to the Equitable Practices Hub, which, as I mentioned, begins with an overview of common language, which is what is equity. And so the department has designated the definition of equity as every student having access to the educational resources and rigor they need at the right moment in their education across race, gender, ethnicity, language, disability, sexual orientation, family background, and/or family income. This would also be inclusive of students with differing gender identities as well as religions. What's important to note is that the purpose of the Equitable Practices Hub is to establish a coherent collection of resources. So the goal of the hub was to create a one-stop shop. As I've shown you, there are a plethora of resources available regarding disproportionality, regarding equity, etc. We wanted to create a space where all of the most premier resources that have been vetted by our intermediate unit partners and other partners are in one place and actually organized in a structure that allows you to prioritize where to spend most of your time. And that's why the pillars are so important. And so, very briefly, as I mentioned, the pillars are listed here for you. The nice thing about the hub is that it also offers you the opportunity to just get a really quick question to let you know which pillar might be best suited for you and or your educational system. And so as we go through this, we can unpack a few of these. So general equity practices globally, systemically, how are we focusing on becoming more equitable? Equity is the antithesis of disproportionality. So when we're looking to achieve equity, that is our way of reducing disproportionate outcomes. As we think about self-awareness, how do we fit into that structure? So how does power, privilege, bias show up in us, but also show up in our system? And what do we have within our locus of control to make those systemic changes? Data practices, how do we know if we're equitable or not? Part of the significant disproportionality work is directly tied to knowing the data, doing those risk ratio calculations. And so we need to know how our practices around data, what data sources we're using, how we're analyzing root causes really makes a difference in the disproportionality outcomes that we see. That also then talks about family and community engagement and how those stakeholders really have a strong input that's necessary for us to know if equity is really taking place. And so, how do we authentically engage families and communities to help us drive the train to ensure that we're being responsive? That then lends itself to academic equity and disciplinary equity. One thing I think to keep in mind is that these pillars are not sequential, so they don't have to go in a specific order. However, there are certain pillars that, in some cases, often have to be the starting point. And so, what I would offer is that before you can get to academic equity and disciplinary equity, it would be imperative to ensure that number one, your data is clean and that you know how to analyze it broadly to detect disproportionality. And also that there's a level of self awareness in your system that's able to unpack and look at those root causes through a lens that is equitable and doesn't put blame on the families and communities, but focuses on what we have control over in our system. That also then speaks to general equity practices. So as we're thinking about how we're implementing frameworks like PBIS or multi-tiered systems of support, what do those structures look like? And are they equitable in their delivery? And how much fidelity is being achieved in each one of those frameworks or practices? And so when we think about academic equity, it's what's happening in classrooms, who has access and opportunity to the different things that are available in our educational communities, and are we providing that equitably? And then disciplinary equity speaks to suspensions, expulsions, restraints, even. Are our school climates positive? Do students feel a sense of belonging in our systems? That's where disciplinary equity has a place. And so those are the pillars. As we scroll down, this hub is also organized into spheres. And so if you think of circles encompassing a person or a young person, in this case, a student, the most outer sphere would be the district and school, the largest one. So our system, how can we focus on that at a larger level? The classroom is the nearest sphere after the district school, and that's more at the classroom level. What is our discipline practice, our pedagogy, our culture in our classrooms, our teachers? How are they functioning in that area? And then moving more inward is the individual. So whether you're a teacher, administrator, a school psychologist, counselor, a school social worker, a caregiver, even a student, how are you promoting equity in your respective community? And so those spheres help us to know when we're in a pillar where we can spend the most time and utilize the resources that have been populated. So the one thing that's important here that I don't want to neglect is the before you begin. I will say this. It is not a requirement that you do this part of the hub before you can access the pillars. It's just highly recommended as a place to know which pillar you should prioritize. And that starts with what's called the criteria for an equitable school tool, which is essentially an equity audit. This was developed by the Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium. And so if you were to click on the audit tool, it should take you to a PDF. And I'm going to make it a little larger. As you access the PDF, this tool, again, is from a school lens. However, the department has really focused on the fact that this tool could also be applicable from a district lens as well. And so it would behoove a district to also look at this tool as a way to gauge where the priorities could be. So as you take a look at this, it gives some criteria on what an equitable school/district could look like. The questionnaire follows. For the sake of today, I'm not going to go through each one of these sections, but just to show you how it looks. So the first one is school policy. There are a number of questions that are dedicated to that particular section, and then a team is to come together and determine if it's a yes, a no, or a needs improvement. Once they determine those things, as we come back out of the audit tool, we would want to prioritize those items that are mostly no's or needs improvement as places to start. So as we come back out, there is a companion action planning guide that goes along with the equity audit to align to the PDE equity pillars of practice so that you know if I'm looking at school policy and I have some yeses and nos, I have some no's and needs improvements. Perhaps I need to focus on general equity practices, which, if you remember, were the larger systemic things that policy often aligns to. So there was deliberation about making sure that that alignment was clear in this action planning guide so that that helps teams to prioritize where to go. So if we click on there, it should take you out into a Word document. And once that Word document is available, and again, for this part, I will make it larger. One more time. And just a little more. Okay. So the instructions for completing the MAEC criteria for an equitable school audit tool that aligns to the pillars of practice is as follows. So there are a few instructions that just should help a team navigate this space. So the district or school equity team should complete the audit tool in totality. It is not recommended to do this in sections. It should be done in totality to offer a baseline on where you are. It's also recommended to do this yearly. Then the specific sections of the audit tool are aligned to the pillars of practice, which are listed there for you. As I mentioned, you also would want to prioritize the sections that are deemed no's or needs improvement. And this is simply a guide to determine strengths and needs, not something that's sent into the department as an evaluation of your district or school. This is solely for your use. We do not collect these. And although the tool describes criteria for an equitable school, a district lens may still be applied and should be applied if you're thinking on a more global systemic level. So as we scroll down, this is just an example again. If you recall in the audit tool, the first section was school policy. The pillar that most aligns to school policy is general equity practices. And so what is asked of the team is to review the items you identified as know or needs improvement and describe the themes that emerge from that. Number one, do we have a policy? If we have a policy, do we have things specific that are not solely a non-discriminatory statement? Those are themes that could emerge. From there, what are the next action steps to improve equitable practices? By who and by when? So this allows a team to really think about, in the time that we have, what's the immediate need, what is the short-term goal, and what is the long-term goal around those action steps. So as we continue to move through the document, you'll see that each of the sections in the audit tool, again, are aligned to a specific pillar or pillars of practice that correspond and allow the team to digest what some of those responses mean. As we scroll to the very bottom, you will see that there is a priority list. So consider determining 3 to 4 areas or sections of priority for immediate focus. We offer 4, however, it may be 1 that is your immediate focus, or you may have more than 4. It would be recommended not to exceed that, because one thing about the equity work is that it's a journey and not a destination. So it would be important to be intentional about the priorities you select. Again, immediate focus is key here. When the audit is completed next school year, can you think about 2 to 3 areas or sections that you predict might be improved? And these might be the ones that you really have the authority and the ability to make change swiftly around. And so those 2 or 3 would be the ones that you would highlight there. So that is the action planning document. If we come back out to the hub, it's indicated that if you have any questions regarding the process, each intermediate unit has an equity point of contact that can help you. And if you're unable to locate your equity point of contact through your intermediate unit, you may email myself at cnhollins@pa.gov, and I would be happy to help navigate that space with you and direct you to your point of contact. So that brings us to the hub itself. As I said, it's organized based upon the pillars, but then also when you go into a respective pillar, you will also see it broken down in the spheres. For the sake of today, I'm going to spend some time in disciplinary equity. When we think of significant disproportionality, each one of these pillars is usable and needed when we consider identification, placement, and discipline. Self-awareness, as I said, is critical. Knowing the data, being able to do risk ratio calculations is critical. Having families and communities at the decision-making table is as well. Focusing on our classroom structures, our frameworks that we're putting in place, whether that's an MTSS or any type of PBIS structure. How are we providing access and opportunity for our students that have been identified as special education students? That's academic equity and general equity practices. And then lastly, our disciplinary practices. How are we ensuring that students with disabilities are not receiving disproportionate outcomes related to suspension, expulsion, and restraint? And so for the purposes of today, I'm going to go to disciplinary equity. And once you are there, a description of what disciplinary equity reflects is noted. And then, as I mentioned, it's broken down into the 3 spheres. I'm going to show as an example district and school. And so while we're in district and school, this particular pillar is arranged in the following topics. And these topics are the same for district school, for classroom, and for individual, but they're based primarily around the specific audience that is designated in the sphere. So as we think about using engaging instruction, for instance, we have resources that are listed here, such as what does engaging instruction look like to enhance equity in education? If I click there, it should take me directly to that document where I can download the file and receive information dedicated to engaging instruction to increase equity and the instructional strategies such as using explicit instruction, prime background knowledge, increasing opportunities to respond, and providing performance feedback. So these are structures and skills that can be used by your system to eventually increase equity in your spaces. That's one example. There are others. So implementing a behavior framework. How do you implement something like PBIS? Or how do you implement social emotional learning processes and practices that are connected to multi-tiered systems of support? How do we embed equity in social emotional learning? And then how do we focus on school climate and equity? Because those things are all very much connected. We then move into collecting and using disaggregated data. So now we're talking about disproportionality. Disaggregating the data allows us to look at specific subgroups and figure out if the systems that we have in place are responsive to those various subgroups, whether they're students with disabilities, students of different races or ethnicities, students who identify as gay, students who are homeless, and the list can go on. That's how we can disaggregate data. So we may even look at free and reduced lunch and look at students that we would deem low socioeconomic status. And so what's here are different resources dedicated to how do we look at addressing and identifying disproportionality? How do we use outcome data? How do we focus on what we're doing to address discipline disproportionality in general? And these are either webinars or articles or videos that will really give us some information to utilize as we're moving through this process. Additionally, developing policies with accountability for disciplinary equity. So this is focusing on how do we make policies that really drive practice to reduce disproportionate outcomes? How do we, again, look at school climate, restorative practices? How do we focus on children with behavior disorders? So this aligns very much with what we're focusing on when we're talking about identification, when we're talking about placement, and when we're talking about discipline. We also know that there's a such thing as the preschool to prison pipeline. So how do we start to mitigate some of these effects as early as preschool? And that's where the Pyramid Equity Project around early childhood really has a place. And then lastly, teaching strategies for neutralizing implicit bias in discipline decisions. So this is focusing on how do some of the things that we think about translate into actions. And implicit implies that there's an unconscious process happening. And so some of our decisions come from that implicit bias that we have about certain families, certain communities, certain students. What are we doing to neutralize those? And how can we support our staff members around that process? As I mentioned, when we go to classroom, those resources will be more teacher focused on how to reduce implicit bias, whereas these are more global for anyone to look at. And then the individual sphere will have even more individualized resources for how we as individuals can handle implicit biases that we know we all have and how they impact our disciplinary decisions. And so that is just a very brief tour of the Equitable Practices Hub that I'm hopeful you will find useful as you navigate the space of reducing significant disproportionality in your various LEA. I want to thank you for your time. I hope that if you have any questions, you will not hesitate to reach out to me or to any one of the supports at Patton, as well as your intermediate unit partners, as well as the Bureau of Special Education. Thank you for your time. I'll part by saying my name is Dr. Nicole Hollins Sims. I can be reached at nhollins, HOLLINS hyphen SIMS at patton.net at any time. Thank you again. Take care.